My name's Max Scagliardi, and this is Always Be Building. If you're watching this episode, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. That helps me out. Or you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. I know that we're going through this rebrand. This is kind of the first episode, although as you will find, there's not going to be much changing on the show other than maybe having a few different types of guests on. Joe Sinnott is on today. He's the founder of Witting Partners. He's an executive coach focused on the energy industry, and he also hosts the Energy Detox Podcast. He's a guy that I've listened to his content over the years. He puts out a lot of great stuff on LinkedIn, just a ton of sage wisdom and advice. And he was one of the people that I called when thinking about doing the rebrand for the podcast. He just has tons of great advice. He focused on leaders with a slant and a bend to the energy industry. But I think his advice is great for anybody who's a builder or even somebody that's just trying to better themselves in general. Joe, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, my pleasure, Max. Appreciate the invite and the intro. Although at the outset, Max, I got to tell you, I identify as a coach, which is very different from an advisor. So I think over the course of this conversation, I'm going to have to correct you a bit. My job is not primarily to give advice or offer sage wisdom or unsavory wisdom or any kind of wisdom, but it's to ask questions. But nevertheless, I'm happy to be here, answer whatever questions you have, and maybe ask you a couple questions here on this rebrand, this rebirth, if you will, of the Always Be Building podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction that you make. And a lot of people may not understand what a coach is. I am guilty of not fully getting it. But then after listening to some of your messaging and after having just conversations with you, it's an interesting bend. It's like you're listening a lot, but you're also asking a lot of questions. And you typically are asking questions that are forcing me to answer that are hard questions, right? They're not like easy questions or just kind of saying yes, yes, and agreeing. You're typically pushing me when we talk to answer a lot of really hard questions about my life and about things that I have going on. So I think it'll be good for the listeners. But one thing we talked about a little bit before this is kind of this framework you kind of put it in energy terms, which I thought was interesting. And I wrote it down here. You talked about this exploration, development, production, transportation, and distribution framework around trying to figure out, what you want to do in life and where you're going. Maybe just kick it to you to start if you want to talk through those a little bit, and we'll kind of riff back and forth, because I felt like it was a great framework to think about things through and to give yourself more of a guided path rather than just out there in the wind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to dive into at least an overview to start on what you just described. So what, Max, you just laid out was 5 phases, if you will, of the energy life cycle. And they're all under the umbrella of what I call the GPS framework that I use. So GPS, again, specifically for leaders in the energy industry, with the G standing for grow, the P standing for protection, and the S for that often tough to define word, sustainability. So GPS.
Right.
But the idea is really what you just said, Max. It's helping people move forward, helping people get to their destination. If they're building something, helping them, figure out what it is they're building, and then finding the best paths or the different optional paths that they can travel down to get to that destination. So that's sort of the high level idea. And going back to that coaching theme, as a coach, I'm there almost as a GPS. I'm not necessarily telling you where to go. I'm giving you options. You could still ignore me, because at the end of the day, you have your hands on the wheel. You're deciding to turn left or right, or again, to kind of go into the building analogy. You're the one who's actually going to be driving the nails and purchasing the lumber and doing all of those things to construct whatever it is you're building. So that's sort of the high level summary in terms of each of those elements you just described. So I'll go through those quickly, Max, but as you just said, it starts with the exploration phase. So in oil and gas, you're looking for something, and you got to figure out what it is you're actually looking for before you go out and start spending money and putting together a plan. And for a lot of people, whether it's in the world of personal development or building a business or starting a family, all of those things, if you don't get crystal clear on what your end goal is, you're asking for trouble. So that's that exploration phase to figure out.
Let's stop right there. That to me is really hard sometimes, because I think that what I found in life is that when you're chasing something, and this goes back all the way to even when I was like in college and picking a major, it's like you think what you want to build or what you want to be or where you want to go. And then I found that you don't really know, or at least I haven't really known until I started going that direction or started, going on that path. And then you find out pretty quickly once you start doing something, whether or not that's really the right thing that you wanted to do. And so I switched majors in college, and completely switched what industry I thought I would be in. Since I've been in doing what I'm doing, I've gone off and done different things. So it's like that exploration, the first part of it, it seems like that would be an easy question. Like, what is it that you want to do? I think it was maybe one of the first questions you asked me. And it's just like, that's also kind of the hardest one. Any advice for people? And it could be related to any phase of their life, whether it's them in their career or like starting out or whatever. But what are some tools or ways that you think that you can help better get you to that answer so you can at least start off at a good foundation before you head down a path?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny because you talk about, different people in different phases of their life. By and large, the same tools that I've seen work for people are the same tools that are used for the CEO of a company and the same tools that I'll talk about to a seminar that I'm giving to high school students. It's the same idea of figuring out what your ultimate values are, your goals, your pillars. And again, you can read 1,000 self-help books on finding your why and all of those things, but you actually need to do it. I mean, it's as cliche and as trite as it can sound. You need to figure out what your ultimate goal is. And a lot of people, they don't have that front and center. So again, case in point, Max, for all the people that I work with, this is typically one of the early exercises we do. And it's to hone in on 4 or 5 pillars, but make sure that you're not stopping short. So what I mean by that is, a pillar is not saying I want to be an engineer or I want to build a business. I want to do those things. Those are all great, but it's that next question. It's that deeper question. Well, so what? What does that do for you? And when you spend a lot of time really, honing in on that, thinking about it, being challenged, typically what people discover, Max, is that it's something deeper than that, right? It's family, it's faith, it's supporting your country, your community. Maybe it's health. For me, I lump in, including all of those things, hard work. I value hard work as a pillar. It drives me. Other examples that people throw out there are connecting with nature. Some people put that in their top 4 or 5. That's what you need to lean on so that you can look through everything else in the framework that we might talk about here, or all the small decisions that you make throughout the day or throughout a career. You can look at all of them through the lens of whether or not you're building towards, you're working towards, you're moving towards, you're driving towards those pillars. So that's the first piece of advice. And typically that's the first piece of homework that I'll give to people, because it's not something you just do on the spot typically.
Yeah, no, it's good. All right. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to riff on that one. You can keep going into the development.
Oh, no, interruptions are good. Interruptions are natural. Again, even though I'll hop up on stage as needed, I much prefer a nice, normal human conversation, Max. So
sure.
So I guess, moving on from figuring out what your destination is, what you're plugging into the GPS, if you will, the next step is the development phase. So again, kind of building in those oil and gas analogies, you need a development plan. You need a strategy. What resources are you going to use to execute on some sort of plan that moves you towards some goal, some destination? And again, from a leadership coaching, executive coaching standpoint, the cliche of people leaning on stale strategies or strategies and approaches that have been used before couldn't be more true. Again, tearing down the, why are you doing this? Why did you settle on this? Why do you feel like you need to do this? I should do this. Whether it's a company that's, been doing the same darn thing for, whether it's performance appraisals or whether it's, their funding mechanisms or all of those things, it's tearing down those strategies and understanding, well, what other paths do you have? What other options do you have? So again, we can talk for hours about this, but that's that key phase there. You need to come up with a plan or strategy. And by and large, if you're just trying to replicate the same plan or strategy as everyone else, whether that's in content creation or putting together a podcast or building a business, odds are you're setting yourself up for some disappointment. So I'll pause there if you have any questions or comments, but that's that idea there in the development phase.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's different ways, I think, to look at what, like you mentioned, if you're just trying to copy other people, that can set you up sometimes for failure. I think trying to be authentic is something I'm really focused on. It's like, who do you want to compete with? All these other people, or do you want to just compete with yourself? Like if, there's only one of you, and if you can be true to yourself, compete with being the best you, Just sometimes it's like you start to get hung up on looking at other people's paths, and whether it be something as simple as like trying to get in shape and comparing yourself to other people, or whether it be something as like building a big business, or, you know, being the best dad you can be, or whatever. It's like you can get really hung up in looking at others versus just saying, hey, I want to be the best version of me and like be the best version of this thing that I'm trying to build. And so I've tried to refocus in on that. But I have found that there are some benefits of looking around to see what works, looking around for mentors, looking around for guidance. And especially in business, if you're trying to do an idea and no one's ever done it, I think the first question is, why has nobody ever done this? There might be a good reason. So it's a mix of that, right? It's like trying to figure out, you know, do I want to just compete with myself, be the most authentic version of me that I can, follow what I'm passionate about? But at the same time, if you're trying to build something, whether it be a business or yourself personally, there are cues you can take from the successes and failures of others, but you don't want to get in that trap, right, where you're comparing yourself to them.
Yeah. And I think, you know, you've done a good job, Max, of sharing over the last couple of days as you introduced the Always Be Building podcast, and how you shared that some of the feedback you've gotten from people, from your audience, is to stick with energy, right? You've shared that. Hey, do what you're good at, stick with that niche. And you've shared that, you're weighing those things, you're taking in that data, but you're also asking why. So you're not seeing this as some false choice between, all right, I'm going to stick with energy or I'm going to go another direction. Clearly, you're seeking some middle ground there, if you will. But a lot of people don't do that. So, to your example of people who are going to, get in shape or go to the gym or work out. If somebody comes to me, especially again, early on in the year, right? You're talking about New Year's resolutions. All right, I joined this new gym. I'm going to get up every day at 5:15 and I'm going to, work out for 45 minutes, all this, whatever. You can sometimes knock them, to the side a little bit and say, well, why? So what? And as logical as you would say, well, I want to get in shape or I want to be healthy or whatever. Again, when you start asking those questions, there are times where you realize that, hey, guess what? Going to the gym, as good as that sounds, everybody else is doing it. It might not actually be as aligned with your destination, your goals, what you're building towards as you think. So that's the key there, Max. And again, I want to give a nod to you because I think you've shared some of that publicly, which is great. Saying, hey, look, I hear everybody. I see the strategies, if you will, the development plans, if you will, that everybody else is doing. And, I still don't believe that is aligned with where I want to head.
Well, so a couple of things. There's huge power in having a niche. And I think that I've seen it through a lot of different content creators, and not just content creators, but business leaders as well. And so I'm always going to have niches. I'm always, my niche is clearly energy. I'm building other niches like real estate and other things that I enjoy doing. We've got other companies in different segments and trying to build those niches up. But, you look at like a guy like Rogan, who is kind of the podcaster. And maybe I mentioned this to you the other day, but like he started out basically just talking about MMA and fighting. And he's, the host, or he's the announcer for MMA for UFC. And had he gone with like the MMA whatever Rogan podcast thing, like he probably wouldn't have been able to grow, not just to be this huge thing. And that's not necessarily my goal, but he probably wouldn't have grown personally either, because he would have been shoehorned into that one talking point. So really, like, the name actually doesn't mean anything. It didn't really mean anything. And that's what some of the people's advice were too. They were like, Talk Energy doesn't mean anything. It's your podcast. You can do whatever you want. You've built this brand here. Why don't you just keep it? That'd be a path of least resistance. But for me, it's like, it's only been 2 years. It's easy for me to pivot. And what people will find this episode, sure, we're like talking about building, but like the next episode I have scheduled for next week is this incredible energy guy. And it'll probably just sound like an episode of Talk Energy. But just like whenever Rogan does like an MMA episode, he gets those guys on. It really, it's great. It's in his wheelhouse. But then he'll have someone on totally random and talk about that other thing too. So for me, it was like, maybe I made a bigger deal about it than it needed to be, but it just felt like from a sustainability standpoint and a growth standpoint, this is kind of the move that I need to make. And then ultimately I feel better. And if I'm not feeling good about it, then what am I doing? Right? Like, why am I even doing it?
Sure.
So I don't know.
Well, and the good thing, of course, Max, is that all roads lead to energy anyway. So I think most of your audience would probably be quick to jump in and say, hey, no matter what guest you have, no matter what topic you have, it is connected no matter what to energy, whether people want to admit it or not. So Now, I don't know if Joe Rogan, I don't know if everything is connected to MMA, although maybe there is some innate desire to fight and win. But at least on the energy front, I think it's safe to say that it is the building block, if you will, of anything that people want to do in life. So again,
all right,
just honoring that false choice that
for sure. Yeah, the false choice. I love that.
You drove right through. You ignored those, and you just kept plowing forward. So
it's like I don't really have to choose. We can do both, and it can be good. Okay, production is the next one on the list.
Production, yeah. So the third stop in the energy life cycle is production. So again, you have a plan, you execute on that plan. In the oil and gas world, you drill some wells, you turn them in line, and what do you get? You get results. You turn them to production, you produce results. And in this world of leadership development and executive coaching, one of the biggest things, Max, that holds people back is that the results that they're looking at don't always speak for themselves. So people, again, get so hung up on results. And again, bottom line results of a company, we're in earnings season now, right? Clearly they mean something. But at the end of the day, a lot of leaders, they don't actually go the next level, right? They don't see what that data is really telling them, or they find themselves being fooled by the data. And again, the best analogy from an oil and gas standpoint is a brand new well that comes on screaming, huge IP rates, and then it turns out to be a clunker. That whole field might be a clunker. And, people may have dumped $1 billion into developing that field based on a handful of early wells, but those results were misleading. So again, coming back to the idea of a new podcast and this rebirth, the question for you, Max, was, well, what are your metrics? What are you looking for? Because in this world of content development and, you have an audience, there's a lot of different metrics you can look at, but what are the ones that actually matter? So again, I'll turn it back to you, maybe to shed some more light on what you're looking to do with the new podcast or the reborn podcast or whatever. But that's the key for people, whether, again, you're building a business and you find yourself looking at things that really don't matter or are steering you astray, or whether you're trying to refine or hone in on your brand or apply for a job or any host of decisions where, again, the metrics, the data might not be telling a full story.
Well, the metrics can be a trap. I think I don't really, what I want to do with the podcast is what I've continued to do, which is have great conversations with interesting people, have it as a fantastic tool for networking, which it has been, create opportunities in business, which it does. And what I've noticed early on in my career before the podcast or any of this stuff was how business development or business opportunities are rarely like a straight line. I mean, sure, you can call somebody on a cold call or on a, trying to contact somebody and maybe get some kind of business from it. But most of business is like these zigzag lines where you know somebody who knows somebody. And then through this relationship or that relationship, something eventually comes about. And a lot of it's trust-based, a lot of it's relationship-based. And so you don't go into, I think it's a trap going into business, just wanting something from someone, right? I think it's a lot easier if you can give to the world and then things will eventually come back to you. And so it's like, a rule that I have that I try to live by is like, I don't like going to have a meeting with somebody and asking for something, right? Or trying to get business. It's like, I don't want to ask somebody for business or need something from them until I've met with them 2 or 3 times, or hopefully more times, until I have a relationship with somebody. Because if you're just doing, and I know some people don't have that luxury. If your job is to cold call, you have to cold call. But ideally, you don't want to be, out there just with strangers asking for things. And so that's where the relationship building comes from and why it's so important when it comes to business and being able to create opportunities for yourself and for the people that you work with. And so I think that the podcast, the goal is still the same. My hope is that I can have a broader platform to be able to do more relationship building, to be able to just continue being creative and doing all the things that it's already done. So that's like, I just want to keep it going. And the other thing is like the longevity of it. And I talked about this too. It's like being in it for the long haul, right? I mean, and I mentioned it on a little solo cast I did last week, but it's like, I can't just have conversations about natural gas storage or whatever, pick an energy topic. I can have that conversation. Some of those conversations I've had 15 or 20 times. I had to deal with Heikkinen, who was coming on regularly, and we were doing a weekly show. I think we both just kind of got to the point where we're like, man, we're talking every week and it's kind of just like the same stuff. So just keeping it fresh, keeping energized. And then the last thing I'll say is on the metrics side, just not getting too caught up into like the metrics. Like the podcast has had steady growth, but things like number of subscribers or number of views, or, that kind of stuff. It's just kind of vanity metrics. Like those metrics are hollow and they look cool at first when you look at it. And then you feel empty afterwards. Like, and what's really cool though, is the people that you meet in real life. They're like, hey, I've been listening, or hey, I've been tuning in, or I've seen what you've posted. And then all of a sudden you feel like you have this connection with that person, and it just creates this frictionless way to meet people and network. And then when you have those conversations in real life, that's the metric that I really like. I like that connectivity with people and meeting people and getting out there. So anyways, that's the rant on that stuff, but hopefully that is relatively
No, it's a good
clear.
rant and a helpful rant. And before we move on, I want to hit on one thing there. And it's the fact that a lot of those connections and the people that have been following you or listening to you, a lot of those haven't engaged, right? They haven't liked, they haven't commented. And that's one of the best lessons. I learned this from another coach who said, hey, the more impact that your post is making sometimes, or the edgier it is, or I don't know what the right word is, but basically, if it's something that people is really resonating, they might not be inclined to like it publicly or admit it, but those sometimes are the ones that actually get the most views and have the most impact. And if you're looking to make a difference and you're looking to forge relationships, that's what matters. But again, you're not going to see that necessarily in the data. And I know we're talking in terms of content, but it's no different from relationships within a business and some of those communication channels within a business. And, people are listening, people are engaged with you sometimes, whether you realize it or not, which is probably a good segue for the fourth phase, if you're ready to move on, Max.
Sure.
So that fourth phase is about communication and getting your message from point A to point B. And of course, this phase, the transportation phase or the transmission phase or the midstream phase, which of course is near and dear to your heart, Max, and Ancova's heart, I'm sure, is about how that content flows, how that information flows, how your message flows. And again, this concept is a little bit different depending on who I'm working with, whether it's, again, the CEO of a company who thinks that his or her message is flowing down to all the reports, and sometimes it's not, or again, whether it's a high school student who's just trying to be seen and make some connections and figure out what he or she wants to do with his life. Either way, it's about getting your message across without suffering the impacts of bottlenecks, which happens, of course, in the pipeline world, and having uncontrolled flow, having corrosion, having releases that, of course, can be catastrophic. And in terms of, sort of the practical things that people that I work with do to make sure that their communication is as smooth and free flowing as possible, is getting surveys, getting feedback from people around them. And again, it seems so cliche. It's so basic. What I do, Max, is not rocket science. But when I have a conversation with a whole host of stakeholders, whether they're friends, family, colleagues, customers, and really start asking questions, without fail, I'm uncovering some corrosive elements to an individual's communication habits, and sometimes where their message is getting bottlenecked. And again, in this world of nonstop content and media, I think that the bottlenecked content tends to be more of an issue than the corrosive content, but all of them can be at play, whether it's in a company or whether it's in a family or whether it's even between friends. So that's that fourth phase, that communication phase, that transportation phase, where you've done all that work at the beginning. You've figured out what your mission is. You've come up with a strategy. You've produced results. Now you need to figure out how to get them downstream.
Yeah. It's tough. It's a hard balance. I mean, I think you can segregate it between a couple of different segments here. Like on the content side first, I think distribution is huge. And this is why you or me, I'll say, and others, I think get stuck in the trap of the engagement farming game. And it's like, I've rarely had big jumps in distribution numbers unless something goes viral. And then I've rarely had anything go viral unless it's something that is some type of engagement farming. Like I've joked, it's like, I can have this really thoughtful piece where you write a blog, and it's like a 5-page blog, and you've poured your heart into it, and it gets like 3 likes or 5 likes. And then, last week, I was at the Petroleum Club here in Oklahoma City. They've got this ridiculous urinal that's like a waterfall into like a bucket of ice, like a thing of ice. And I took a picture of it, and it got like 500 likes. And I'm like, okay, so a picture of a urinal will get 500 likes, and then a blog post gets 5 likes. So But you hope that, from the picture of the Petroleum Club urinal and a cheeky comment about how oil and gas is built different, you pick up 50 followers from the oil and gas world, and then hopefully they stick around for the actual content. So there's that balance between building out the distribution channel, trying to get people to engage, and then trying to get your real message across. And so that's on the content side. I think in the business side, it's hard because you try to scale a business, and it's really difficult to scale unless you have other people and other leaders and employees and partners in that business. And so you have to empower those people. And then once they're empowered, that's kind of a code word for you don't have to babysit them. They can do their own thing. But then the pendulum can swing the other way too, where you look up and you haven't talked to somebody at your company in 2 weeks, and because maybe they're a lower level person, or I don't even want to say lower level. I don't even like looking at it like that. It's pretty flat in any of the stuff that I do. We're not huge on hierarchical structures, but there's somebody that maybe is more administrative, or that you don't have a reason to interface with them for a multiple weeks period. And then when you do talk to them, you realize like, man, I should be talking to this person, more frequently. Or it's a partner or whatever it is. Like there's communication in business. I think that you set up structures to where you don't have to talk and communicate every day, but then that can swing too far the other way. And you find yourself in a position where maybe your messaging is not, you're not doing a good enough job there. And then the last piece of it is like your friends and family. And it's like your family, you're so focused on all these other things like content and business and all this stuff. And you're really trying to build and grow. And then you just want to make sure that you're also communicating and getting that distribution there as well. And so those are like the things that I struggle with if I had to put them in buckets, and where I try to be better at is like, the content stuff, making sure that we're doing the right things and getting the right message out, but also growing the audience, the business stuff, making sure that we're performing, but you're also keeping the relationships with your people. And then the home stuff, making sure that, the work-life balance, and that you're continuing to communicate there as well. And it's a struggle. Those things aren't as easy as, I'd hope that they would be, but you just got to work at it.
Yeah. And in all of those environments, Max, whether it's personal environment, family, at work, whatever the case is, the first step is being conscious of all of those things, being conscious of who you're not spending as much time talking to as you might like, or the people that you're spending more time talking to. Just being aware of those things is the first step. And again, it sounds cliche, but it's true, because then once you're aware of it, you can go down a couple different paths. One, you could be stressed out and say, oh no, I want to spend more time with my wife, or I want to spend more time with this employee, or whatever the case is. But many times, and this is where, again, I get to do this for a living as a coach, many times when people will bring that to my attention, or when we'll talk about the realities of where your communication focus is or isn't, it's a question of, so what? If you didn't spend as much time talking with your wife this week as you would like, well, what are the ramifications? So what? Does she know this? What if you had a 1-minute conversation letting her know that and coming up with a plan of when you are going to sit down and talk and connect? That can be a very simple plan that can erase a lot of anxiety for people who are in that camp where they're carrying all this anxiety. And again, those are just specific examples. Everybody's different, but Max, it all comes down to awareness, to consciousness. Heck, the name of my company, Witting Partners. The whole idea is there's a lot of people who are unwittingly going through the motions, conducting business without any real awareness of the impact they're having, or how they're ruining relationships, or how they're communicating in a toxic way. So many leaders, so many humans, quite frankly, even in their personal relationships, are unconscious of the impacts that their behaviors are having. That's it. And again, that's why I enjoy doing what I'm doing. As I said before, it's not rocket science. It's collecting all this data, laying it out there, and then coming up with a plan that helps an individual move closer to his or her destination. And again, as you can imagine, the bulk of the time that I spend with people is on communication. It is on how they're conveying or not conveying whatever their ultimate message is, and how well they're able to articulate it, as I said before, without their message getting bottlenecked and without causing unnecessary or harmful corrosion.
Yeah, that's good. No, I think that knowing it and making sure that you are aware of it is massive, because then because if you're not, then you can't take the steps that you need to take to make it better. Let's go to we made it through them all. Do we go through transportation and distribution on that last one?
So we didn't quite wrap up with distribution. So obviously
Okay.
they're connected there. So we can quickly end here on the 5th phase, which is distribution. So again, from a communication standpoint, you've moved stuff downstream, But the distribution phase is really about understanding who your audience is, who your stakeholders are, again, to use the ubiquitous stakeholder term, who your customers are, and understanding, again, what they're seeing, what do they want? And most importantly, Max, how are they viewing you? Are they looking at you? And again, we're talking now from a leadership standpoint, but as a leader, are they looking at you as a differentiated leader? Are you any different from any other leader that a company can pull off a shelf, or even in a family, right? As a father, you getting to the point where your kids are like, man, I know that mug says that he's the best dad in the world, but I mean, is he really that different from all the other dads out there? And this is an important step, not for self-preservation, not to pat yourself on the back, but because if your downstream customers or households, again, if you're distributing natural gas or whatever it is, if they are not looking at you as a differentiated leader or as a differentiated service provider, then that trust can start to erode, right? The confidence that they have in you might start to erode, and that can hinder their ability and your ability to, again, move towards whatever the ultimate destination is. And I've shared this, a lot, publicly even, because this analogy works perfectly in a commodity business. In a commodity business, your electron, your molecule of methane is no different from anybody else's. So the question is, how do you become a differentiated commodity? What is it that you're doing differently that your customers, your downstream stakeholders are looking for and what they actually want? And that's that key in that step, Max. And, having multiple distribution channels and multiple ways to connect with people is key. And again, I'll turn it over to you. You're far more of an expert in that than I am when it comes to the world of content creation and maintaining those distribution channels, maintaining those connections so that different people can connect with you in different ways, because that is what helps differentiate you, right? That's what helps make your commodity, which on paper is no different from anybody else's, more appealing than everybody else.
Yeah, it's hard. I think you asked me this question the other day around where do the listeners find value and what are they tuning in for? And the answer is, it just depends. I think different people find different values in different things. And I think it's an easier question for me to answer around the customers in our businesses, in our service business, in our energy marketing business. I have a pretty good sense of what they value. And I think in our real estate stuff, we have a pretty good sense of what they value. I hope that in my family and personal life, I've got to, typically with them, they value you being around and being, there and present and mindful. So it's not hard, there. But so a lot of those things, I think there's a more tangible, you get the feedback, right? It's like if your wife's not happy with you, you're going to know probably pretty quick. If your customers aren't happy with you, I think you're going to know because they'll let you go or fire you, or you'll have to talk to them. But I think where it gets hard is in the content stuff, because you really don't have, yes, you will get some feedback from people, but I think that unless you're just so hyper niche to where, you just talk about this one sliver of thing that's the same topic every week, I think that may be easier to find what, the value is versus even something like energy, which is relatively niche. It's still pretty broad. I mean, like I'll notice that I mentioned to you the other day, I feel like a lot of guests tune in because they clearly are trying to find some kind of value. And so I've noticed episodes where we talk about things like the markets and how, that's playing out with OPEC or natural gas storage or, LNG export facilities, things like that. Those episodes tend to be popular. There's a lot of people that are in the investing or amateur investing world that want to try to make good investment decisions, even though this isn't investment advice, but they want to hear all this macro stuff. I think that, the macro episodes do well. But it surprises me because different people will tune in for different reasons. I'll have an episode that didn't get that many, good listens in terms of like the numbers weren't as high. So it maybe didn't pull as many people in, but then I'll have some people be like, oh, I love that episode. That was such a great interview, So I think with the content, it's hard because you're just not getting that immediate feedback like you would in these other relationships in your life where you're face to face with people and you're talking to them, because it's just like, you just see clicks, you just see likes, you just see engagement, and you see downloads and views. And so you kind of have a measure of it, but at the same time, there's the algorithm, there's all these different things in the background. So it is a hard one to answer in terms of what does the audience find the most value in? I think that's tough, but just try to do the best you can and put out the content that you're proud of. That's what I start to put it back on me. I'm like, well, does it matter? Yes, it matters if they find value or they won't tune in, but at the same time, like, has to kind of be mutual. Like, I have to feel like what I'm putting out is value as well, because I hope that shines through and they can pull some from it.
Yeah. And again, you said a couple times in that response there, Max, that, it can be tough, right? It can be difficult, but it becomes far more difficult when you don't have clarity on that first step we talked about, that exploration phase. And that's where, again, I enjoy helping people get back and focus and say, well, so what? All right, you don't have a good picture of what your audience wants today. Are you continuing to move forward? Are you continuing to build, if you will, for, playing off of the always be building analogy, or in oil and gas? Again, are you moving forward? Are you doing things that will help produce more energy, plentiful energy, clean energy, all of these things, even if, on this particular day, you're moving a little bit slower or you're off on a tangent? Are you making that continual progress? And if you actually have a destination in mind, then you can answer that question pretty easily in most cases and not get hung up on those intermediate steps of, well, what does my audience want? Oh, should I send out a poll? Oh, what are the views today? And again, we're back on the content thing, but it's no different, right? It's almost, going back through all 5 of those phases that we just talked about. And the people that are most successful and the people that have the most sustainable approach to life and to business and to their family are the people that are conscious of all 5 of those steps, Max. That's what I find in my work, is that if I can get people aware and conscious of all 5 of those steps and not get hung up on any single one, they're the ones who are able to keep moving forward. They're the ones who are able to, deal with a detour more easily, or a traffic jam, a figurative traffic jam, or a little traffic jam. And that's my goal when I work with people. And, sometimes, obviously, I make my money because I help them uncover a potential traffic jam. That's where the real gold is. But even when I'm not helping people uncover these big, life-changing discoveries, I'm helping them move forward faster and more efficiently. And I think from you and your podcast and the idea of always be building, your goal, and again, I'll turn it over to you. I don't want to speak for you, Max, but my interpretation is that your goal is to help people continually build better, more efficiently, more confidently, and establish that foundation that they can continue building upon. And I think that's great. And I think it's a good vision and a good view that, again, a lot of podcasts, a lot of content, a lot of people, a lot of leaders and companies, billion-dollar companies, don't have a grasp on. So again, I'm happy to have had the opportunity there to step through all 5 of those phases. Happy to dive into anyone in more detail or provide additional anecdotes or questions about how that's applied in the real world. But that's it.
Yeah.
That's the GPS for energy industry leaders framework.
For sure. And I got more questions for you here. I've got some lists. I know this has been kind of back and forth and focusing on the pod stuff, which I appreciate you doing. And the last thing I'll say on it really is that the always be building is just really broad. I mean, at the end of the day, you listen to podcasts because you want to build knowledge. And sometimes that's knowledge about the markets or about an energy topic or about whatever, but you're clearly tuning in because you want to build knowledge and you care about learning, or at least that's why I listen. I think that's what people listen for. Maybe they like great storytelling, but ultimately you're trying to build knowledge and learn. And I think that's what we're going to continue to do, is have great conversations with people that we can learn from and that we can gain something from. And really the main pivot is just to be able to do that in a better and broader way and to keep it fresh and to keep adding that value. So we've hit on that. We'll move on. I want to ask you about what you've built. And when we first talked years ago, you were leaving the corporate world behind. I think I tweeted earlier, once you get out of the corporate world, it's like getting out of prison for the first time. You feel that taste of freedom and you then try to work really hard, or at least a lot of people. I know some people go back and that's overly generic, but I think people with
they go back to prison. Is that what the analogy?
Yeah. It felt like prison for me, but not for everybody. Some people like it, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can have a very meaningful life and career working at a big company. I don't want to downplay the significance of how much meaning and value people can get from it. But for me personally, and I think for other entrepreneurs, that like to build and that like to be out in the, in the world and doing their own thing, it can feel very restrictive, not being hyperbolic and calling it prison. But basically you've gone out and you've done your own thing. I think from the outside looking in, it seems like you're thriving. You've put out a bunch of different content. Walk me through that personal journey of deciding to be a builder on your own and to go out, and what was the vision and the drive and the motivation to start doing what you're doing?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess in terms of the decision, my release from prison, if you will, was not entirely, a decision on my own. So I guess, rewinding back to 2019, I had been working for EQT, which by that time had become the largest natural gas producer in the United States. I've been there 11 years and was very comfortable working for a 130-plus-year-old company, had the best teams around me, had the support of management all the way up to the top. And, it was one of those situations where I was happy to be in prison. It didn't feel like prison. And, I had all the, well, again, maybe we'll move away from that analogy, but the moral of the story is I was happy.
It was a bit of an engagement. It was a bit of an engagement farm analogy, but anyways, go ahead.
but as fate would have it, there was a change of management. Again, we could probably spend hours talking about all of the changes that occurred at EQT in 2019 and in 2017 and 2018 before that. And long story short, it became clear that my time at EQT would be coming to an end. Me and about 200 other folks there in the fall of 2019 said farewell to EQT as new management came in. But in the months leading up to that, Max, I did have time to ponder a bit. I was very lucky, to know with a couple months heads up that I and a lot of my peers would likely not be at EQT anymore. So I had time to really think about, all right, well, what do I want to do next? And again, we can bring in the building analogy and say, all right, well, it makes sense to keep building on what I had done for the prior 15 years in the oil and gas industry. But do I really want to do something that just tries to replicate where I had been at EQT, which was a mix of, engineering roles, leading different teams, moved more into the operational planning and into the world of data governance and analytics. I was very lucky to have seen lots of different things and gotten a taste for different things. But did I want to continue down that path of managing teams in that corporate environment? And it became very clear to me, Max, in that lame duck period, if you will, that what got me to where I wasn't necessarily my technical prowess, but it was more on building teams, developing teams. And I'd had an executive coach. I'd seen the first, second, third degree benefits of having a coach. And so by the time September of 2019 came and it was time for me, and again, all those folks to say farewell, I knew that I wanted to focus on coaching in the oil and gas industry, to take all that experience, to build upon it, and to do something that, millions of other people do, right? I mean, there's no shortage of leadership coaches and books and podcasts and blogs and everything else. But how many were focused on oil and gas, and how many leveraged real world experience in the corporate environment, having, the technical roles and building teams and all of that. So I guess I can pause there, but I mean, that was the genesis, Max, of again, having the luxury of being able to think through those things consciously and not be scared or forced into some immediate knee-jerk reaction, which is exactly what I try to replicate with people who, aren't in a similar position in terms of, again, having some awareness that their job is coming to an end or whatever the case is, but trying to slow people down so that they can think as clearly and consciously and fully as I was able to do during that period.
What do you think some of the challenges are specific to oil and gas? I mean, I have got some thoughts around the industry. I think that it's its own. I mean, there's some things, obviously, any big industry or corporate industry is going to have some similarities. The oil and gas industry specifically is kind of its own animal for a lot of different reasons. There's the public persona of the industry. There's the internal structures. Some of these companies tend to be a little bit more old school, especially the bigger ones. But just, do you think it's been a benefit to you to have that as your focus? And is that basically, that's really what you're catering to, is like, look, there's all these executive coaches, like you mentioned, and people that can give advice. I guess you don't want me to say advice earlier. You said not to be an advisor, but they can do coaching. But what are the unique differentiators for oil and gas leaders, if there are any, and how does that help you having that background?
Yeah, there's a whole host of differentiators. One, of course, is the volatility. So again, no matter
Yeah.
how long you've been in this industry, if it's been more than, a couple of weeks, you experience the ups and downs. And obviously other industries have ups and downs. I think every industry had ups and downs thanks to COVID, but nothing like energy. And that takes a toll on people. So in working
Right.
with, new leaders especially, but even seasoned veterans, managing teams that are exhausted from the macro volatility, let alone the internal volatility of mergers and acquisitions and ups and downs. And again, who knows what earnings season is going to bring us this year as companies release stuff. But that's one of the big ones, Max, is that those ups and downs and the volatility. And again, getting people to slow down and realize how much stuff, doesn't change, how much stuff stays the same. And it's this idea of sustainability. Again, my tagline for the company, fueling sustainable leaders. It's that idea that leaders need to help people keep moving forward and not get stuck and throw up their hands and bang their heads against the desk because we're in a dip. Again, whether it's a commodity dip or just some growing pains of a company. So volatility is one. The other big one is the dynamic between the office and the field. That is one thing, especially as people move from the field into the office. There is a whole litany of things that can go wrong. Again, you talk about checking the box on all of the sort of the 5 phases of the energy life cycle leadership development program. When it comes to coming from the field to the office, especially in leadership role, there's a lot of issues with communication and awareness. And again, especially sometimes that, the corrosive nature that we might have unwittingly, unconsciously. So that's another one to work through with people who are making that transition. And again, coming back to my own background, when you've spent time in the field, when you've managed teams who are in the field, when you've spent, 3 years of your life on an offshore drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico, again, having that experience and knowing that there's different ways to communicate, there's different pressures that come with field life versus office life. Those are some of the big, again, differentiators and some of the big value adds, if you will, that I bring to the table as a coach focused on this industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. Those are all really good ones. And hearing you say it out loud, it seems obvious, but I'm glad that you articulated it that way. One question that I have
Max,
for you,
everything I do is obvious. We said that in hindsight, like I said, nothing I do is rocket science. It's just being focused and taking the time and asking a bunch of dumb questions. So again, lest anybody actually thinks, as you said at the beginning, I'm spouting any sort of sage wisdom. I just want to set the record straight, Max. I am not. So anyway, sorry to interrupt.
You've taken the time to put the framework together and to think about it. I mean, like, this is something that we try to do with our consulting, is that, again, it's not necessarily rocket science, but there is a framework to think about these problems through. And a lot of times people get hung up, focused on the wrong thing. Like if it's a gas or midstream contract negotiation, they're super focused on, maybe what the fee that they're getting charged or whatever it may be. And that's certainly an important thing to focus on, but there's a whole framework that they need to view what they're trying to accomplish through. And it's not just getting the highest fee. It's things like, is the capacity available? Is the counterparty someone who's trustworthy? Do you want to work with this person? Who's your point of contact going to be when problems do arise? There's all these human elements to it. There's just so many different things to check those boxes. Mm-hmm. And you really have to have that holistic framework on not just, well, I know this guy's got this fee, this guy's got this fee, which one should I pick? It's like, well, that's just one variable in this whole framework that we've spent years putting together. None of it's rocket science, but you just have to think about it right, including all those variables to make sure that you're making the right decision. And I feel like it's similar to like what you're doing. It's like, again, like you said, it's not like any of this stuff is crazy complicated, but most people aren't taking the time to put the framework together to think about it in the correct way and make sure they're being thorough and doing all the right steps.
Which is another element of our industry, right? I mean, go, go, like we don't stop. And that makes it difficult to slow down. And it's funny too. You mentioned, contract negotiations and midstream contracts. A lot of what I do is informed by my role in being a part of contract negotiations on midstream contracts and all of the, the various conversations and the personalities and the numbers and the priority and all those things that go into that. If I had this framework and, thinking through things, I don't know that things would have been differently, but it's funny now to go back and look at all of those experiences from the world in oil and gas, and obviously to read headlines now. And as I work with individuals to hear, what they're going through, and again, see it through this lens that I have now that I'm lucky to have. And again, quite frankly, Max, it's fun. I enjoy doing what I'm doing. Hopefully that comes across here. And enjoy conversations like this to offer some insights and to share a little bit behind the curtain of what I get to do.
Absolutely. Okay. So a question I have for you, and this is something that I deal with because when we typically are working with companies, I'm working with decision makers, not always, but a lot of times you are speaking to executive level or vice president level or director level people, a lot of big personalities in this space. And you meet a lot of different types of C-level, C-suite type people and executive people. And they can sometimes be a challenge personality wise. What are like some of the things that you deal with when you're working with, say, a CEO or a higher level management person in terms of, a lot of these people are successful, they're driven, they clearly have gotten to some place in life because of those traits, but some of those traits can also be a negative if you're not introspective. And if, like, for example, if you're someone who's been really successful, you may start to think you're always right, that your methods are the only methods. But just talk to me about the challenges of dealing with executives and CEO types when trying to help them be better builders, be better leaders.
Sure. So when I'm dealing with the type of leader who may be more blunt and may be somewhat corrosive in his or her communications, if you will, is that putting it politely enough? When I'm dealing directly with those people and helping them understand the impacts of their approach, it can be very delicate, Max. I mean, there's a lot, again, you've been around this industry. There's a lot of people who, any sign of trying to soften their approach or make them be more thoughtful or slow down is dismissed, is seen as a bunch of fluff, right? Now, in 2023, I think by and large, leaders are aware of, this idea of executive coaching and how it benefits them. But again, human nature, especially if it's been 2 or 3 decades of having these behaviors, it could be tough to attack. So the number one thing, again, it depends on the audience, obviously, but the number one thing is to help them understand how their actions are adversely impacting the bottom line, whatever that bottom line is for them, right? It could be as simple as money. It could be simple as their bonus. It could be simple as their legacy. It might be more personal in nature, but that's the first sort of step. And again, a lot of times it might not be blatant on my end, Max, because I need to avoid trigger words. And again, that can sound kind of silly, but it's true. My goal is to disarm the people that might be inclined to pounce, if you will, or have some of those edgier personalities. So it's me finding ways to disarm them. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Again, it depends on the audience. Sometimes it's humor. Sometimes, again, it's literally just mapping out how they communicate, who they're connected to, what their ultimate goals are, doing a little reverse engineering, and then finding those holes in their approach, or again, some areas of corrosion. So again, sort of a long-winded answer to that element, but that's the key. On the flip side, and I spent a lot of time with this too. Obviously, I'm working with individuals who need to communicate with those people directly, and their job is not to coach somebody in the C-suite who might be a little rough and might not be the best listener, might not have an open mind. So I help those people identify ways to disarm their audience. And again, sometimes it's humor, sometimes it's little tips and tricks, and we can talk about some of the detailed ones and different scenarios. But it all comes down to disarming, whether it's me disarming somebody so that they can work better, or me giving other people the tools to disarm their audience so that they can get their message across without as much fear as they might have going into it, if that makes sense, Max.
Absolutely. No, it's good. What about some of the pitfalls you see people falling into that are in these leadership roles? Is it similar things you'll see? Is everybody different? Or is it like when you get in and start to analyze or listen like you do, are there commonalities around where you find people need to improve? Is it, you've got this formula on how to ask the right questions, how to listen? Are there commonalities around issues that come up that you see that people can be better at? And if so, what are those?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, especially with emerging leaders, is sustainability, not from an environmental standpoint, but sustainability in terms of maintaining pace. And again, this might sound cliche, right? You think back through leadership books and everything. It's like, oh, well, you had this doer, this person who was an individual contributor. They became a manager. They're go, go, go. Now they have the worst of both worlds, right? They're trying to manage a team and they still have individual responsibilities. So when they're in that environment, a lot of people, again, in our industry, they don't slow down, right? They're still now just trying to wear both of those hats, and it's not sustainable. So that's one thing I see. Again, it rises certainly to C-suite levels, but for a lot of the middle management, sort of the emerging leaders, it's that, hey, what you're doing right now, the habits that you have, you cannot maintain those. So with those people, a lot of the time I spend with them on is coming up with what you might call, an ideal schedule, if you will. And again, there's lots of different variations, but essentially saying, all right, you got 168 hours in the week. Let's map things out. Ideally, there's no ideal in oil and gas, but ideally, what would you be spending your time on? Where are you going to get the most bang for your buck so that you can do it consciously? So you can actually build in the potential of sleeping. Again, no guarantees, but if you don't plan for some sort of ideal, then your odds of achieving it are basically zero. At least if you plan for it, there's some hope. So that sort of sustainability, you can call it burnout, whatever it is, that is probably one of the biggest ones. As you move up the ladder, Max, I'd say the biggest thing is that people don't share information with leaders. They don't hear it, right? And so going back to your previous question, helping those leaders, of course, open up those channels of communication so people aren't scared to open up. And there's different things you can do there, right? I mean, some of the simplest are, if you are the senior person in a room, of course, shutting up, not offering your opinion or advice or whatever it is until everybody else has spoken. Again, it's so cliche, but it's so, it's a rule, if you will, that is so violated, and it prevents ideas from flowing up to the decision makers. So again, I'll pause there. Again, there's a whole host of things. It's probably like a Venn diagram, right? There's a lot of different things that overlap depending on the leader, but I'd say that burnout, unsustainability piece, and then the unconscious stifling of, ideas and information is the other one.
That's interesting. What about one thing I've noticed when working at bigger organizations is there's like I almost like look at this a lot. I see it in, for example, with doctors. It's that they have this whole schooling background with it's all math and science and standardized testing. And there's all these skills you have to be really good at that typically, not always, but typically are people that may not be really good at these soft skills. Your brain, you kind of get allocated what your talents are, right? If you're super good at taking the SAT, that doesn't mean you can't be a great public speaker and be a great human communicator, and good with soft skills, but people typically don't get all of it, right? So, and I see that in the oil and gas industry, you've got a lot of brilliant engineers, scientists, very technical type people who are also needed, right? The industry has to have that. And so those people are highly recruited. They are then typically put into positions that are meaningful within an organization. And a lot of them rise to high levels, leadership levels in these companies. But yet, just because you're a really good engineer or really good technical person, that doesn't always translate to being a really good manager, people person, having the communication skills, having the soft skills. And oftentimes what I've found, and this is not a rule, but it's something that I've seen a trend, is that the people that are really good on those technical sides may be deficient sometimes in the human side. Is that a trend that I'm blowing out of proportion, or is that something that you think in the industry there is a need there to help those technical people get better at the soft skill side?
There is some fuel to that stereotype, Max. So yeah, it is true. There are a lot of technical people who, either by their own admission or from some third party, would say, yeah, you don't have those soft skills. But then the question becomes, well, can you develop those soft skills? Is this a person that's receptive to them? And that could be a little bit trickier. So again, a couple things that I have seen are scenarios where there is a clear individual, knock it out of the park, say engineer or technical person, whatever. And it is pretty apparent to a lot of people that, this person, management isn't their strong suit. And of course, that's okay, Max, right? Clearly. I mean, everybody has a role and they can be the best version of themselves, or again, whatever cliche you want to throw out there, without having some manager title. But the problem in organizations is there's a lot of leaders who are too scared to communicate that. They're inclined to say, well, let's give it a chance. Let's see how this plays out. Let's give this person a leadership position and see how it goes, even though the odds are pretty low. And sometimes that works out, of course, but a lot of times it doesn't. And that's a shame, not because, hey, you can't go back in time and all right, you can get your old role. But again, I don't know if we go back to that prison analogy from earlier, but once you've been in prison, you leave prison, you kind of got that mark. And once you've gone into management, and if you've failed, if you feel like you failed, that's that's a tough thing to overcome, both as an individual and if you're still within that company or even, within that region. And so working through that takes energy. It takes coaching sometimes. And it goes back to was that a bad decision in the first place? And again, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So I don't want to say that there's one right answer, but I see it a lot. And it comes down to poor leadership when it comes to putting people in these positions. And this is one thing I shared. Oh gosh, this was probably a year or two ago, but it's a recurring theme. And it's this idea that a lot of leaders, quite frankly, are chickens. I had this conversation with a human resources leader in the industry, and she shared this exact anecdote, some of these things that I've seen. And she said, oh yeah, I see this. And, a lot of times the manager is too afraid to tell their employee that, hey, you know what? I think this is a better path for you. What do you think about that? They're afraid to have that conversation, which again, seems absurd, but it happens. And it's costly in terms of time, money, energy. So again, that was maybe one answer to your question. I'll pause there, Max, but the moral of the story is it depends on the leader, of course. There's different ways to help people get those soft skills. Obviously, I mean, that's a lot of what I do. But in terms of the genesis of why you're putting that person in the position in the first place, the vetting that goes on there is not as thorough in a lot of companies as it should be.
That's good. I've got a few more minutes. We're at an hour here. Do you have a couple more minutes to go, or do we need to wind it down?
Oh, I got time on this stuff. This is until I hear the pitter patter of feet above my head here. I think we're good to go.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, my wife was calling me. I have everything on silence, but her phone calls still come through because I'm not allowed to have those ones blocked. So if it's coming through, it's her right now. But I texted her. She's just inside. Last thing is I'll ask, and then I want to get any book recommendations you have, because this is a question I'm going to start asking people because I love reading, so you can think about it here now. But last thing is the age spread between, how there's got these big tranches in oil and gas where you get a downturn, and then there's this big gap where a lot of young people don't come in. I think last year there was a thing that came out, said it was like the lowest in a really long time for people getting like petroleum engineering degrees, for example. But that's not the only thing, right? I mean, it's across the board. People, don't come into the industry whenever there's a downturn. And then to make it worse, there's so much negative messaging around oil and gas from the ESG crowd and other people. Kids are being taught and think that oil and gas won't exist when they're older. Some of them, right? So there's these big chunks and gaps. That's a whole other topic. We don't get into it. But point is that there's a lot of these times when the industry's slow. Do you see companies struggling with that? Do you work with companies to try to empower young people or talk about the leaders about, hey, we need to, pull on these younger resources? I've seen examples of big corporations where they don't at all. And I've seen other companies I've worked for where they did a really good job about it, doing it. Just your thoughts around this age distribution and the potential issues or opportunities that it can provide within these organizations.
Yeah, the biggest opportunity that I see with a lot of the organizations that I work with is to better connect what individual employees, again, especially the younger employees, the fresher employees, or even potential employees, to connect their role to these high level goals that the company has. So for instance, there might be companies out there that are doing a good job of telling their story and combating some of the misleading ESG messaging, if you will, or some of those that are against our industry. And that's good that those companies are investing money publicly doing that. But what some of those companies fail to do is connect the day-to-day work of each employee, no matter where they sit. They could be in accounting, they could be in supply chain, they could be in engineering, they could be anywhere in the company. How is what they do connected to this noble goal, these noble ambitions that this corporation theoretically has? And those are opportunities, Max. And a lot of companies, they fail to make that connection. So again, you have this pocket where, yeah, that messaging is crystal clear at the director level and up. But then those people who are out in the field or who are in jobs that might not have, exposure to operations or to different things, they're just kind of there doing their job. And when you don't have that whole portion of your workforce as an advocate, and more importantly, as someone who just understands how his or her role is connected to the bottom line, you're again, it's not sustainable. And that's what I see a lot of, Max. It's missed opportunities to connect. They'll spend lots of time, lots of money, lots of energy crafting a message. Externally, it might look good to you. It might look good to me, but internally there's a divide. And that's the gap. That's the opportunity that I see. And that's the only way you're going to have an enthusiastic, younger generation of workers, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's good. No, I agree with that. Any, like I mentioned earlier, any good books that you like or would recommend? I'm going to start asking this question of people because I always like hearing it, and I'm always trying to add to my stack of things that I want to consume on the book front.
So I think it's funny you asked this too, because it's a common question, right? Book recommendations. What do you think? The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is what the quintessential, leadership book. Stephen Covey.
I haven't read it. I started it. I didn't finish it. My dad had a copy. I need to finish it.
Well, finish it and read it once a year, because, in this world of leadership development, again, which is seemingly unlimited, I feel like 90% of the books out there are just a derivative of those 7 habits. I mean, it's good stuff. It's basic stuff. I feel like Stephen Covey had it figured out, whatever that book was written 25, 30 years ago, maybe. So again, I see that as the go-to that pretty much everything else flows from. So that's what I would go to there. And then the other book, and this is a book, honestly, you don't have to finish reading, because the concept is so simple, but this really changed my thinking in terms of how I coach, even, how I lead others, how I led others in the past, how I work with my family, how I make decisions, how I help other people make decisions. And it's Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. So Annie Duke is or was a professional poker player. And the concept, very simply, again, not to spoil the whole book, but again, the concept is pretty simple, but pretty powerful. It's this idea that, we're constantly making decisions. We make, thousands of decisions a day. And it's all about just boosting your odds of those decisions being, better. There's no guarantee. And most decisions don't actually matter, but a lot of people get hung up on them. So recognizing that, the decisions you make as a leader, as an individual, as a father, as a husband, whatever, it's all statistical. There's no guarantees. And once you realize that, and you realize how many decisions you make, it's a lot easier to move through and to not get hung up on decisions. And then the final piece I'll say to that, Max, is that decisions don't necessarily correlate with results, of course, right? You might make the best decision in the world. Sports is a perfect analogy. And Annie Duke uses a lot of sports analogies. And obviously from a gambling standpoint, the decision to, go for 2 towards the end of the game instead of kicking the extra point, you can pick out your card and you can make the decision that the card says, but, maybe you're not successful and you lose the game, whatever. That doesn't make the decision the wrong one just because the result was poor. And helping people understand that reduces so much anxiety, helps them move and build more freely and successfully. And again, that's a concept, Max, that touches everything that I do. So 2 books there. So Thinking in Bets and the old 7 Habits by Stephen Covey.
Fantastic. That's a great way to end it. Joe, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for the offline advice as well. Tell everybody where they can find you and contact you if they want to talk to you about doing some work.
Great. Well, my pleasure, Max. Happy to come on and share all of this. And if people are interested in communicating further, LinkedIn, of course, is always a good option. Or you can head on over to wittingpartners.com, WITTING partners, where you can find all my content information about what I do, including links to the podcast. So the podcast is The Energy Detox, available on all your podcasting platforms, where, again, dive into timely, topical, energy-focused leadership themes that are helpful and relevant to most of the people that would be listening here. Because from a leadership standpoint, whether you're in oil and gas or whether you're in some other industry, or again, whether you're a father, brother, husband, son, whatever, it's all the same stuff. It's about making decisions better, faster, and more confidently. So with that, Max, again, I welcome conversation from any of your listeners out there. And again, thank you for the time to have this conversation.
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Take care.